Welcome to this panel on that marks the first anniversary of the Arab Spring, whatever that might be. As we'll see, that's an issue that our panelists want to discuss. My name is Sujit Choudhry, and I teach here at the Law School at NYU. And so before I introduce my panelists, let me just frame a little bit about what this panel is really the beginning of. Which is a focus over the course of the next several years at NYU on the whole phenomenon of political and constitutional transition, much of which will be run through a new center that will be launched at the end of March this year, called the Center for Constitutional Transitions at NYU. And so for those of you who are students in the program who are going to be continuing here, it might interest you to know that we will have, among our activities, a clinical education program that will bring JD and LLM students to be working with regional partners in the first instance in the Middle East to provide support for their technical advice giving to transitions that are underway across the region. And in addition, we're going to be, our launch will be on March 30th. With Justice Tahani al-Jabali of the Egyptian Supreme Constitutional Court coming as a one-week visitor to NYU, and we'll be having a symposium on constitutional transitions on the Middle East to mark her visit. So there'll be other announcements of this sort. And so without further ado, let me begin by introducing our panel. To my right is Dr. Isobel Coleman, who is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations for U.S. Foreign Policy, and who is also director of the Civil Society Markets and Democracy Initiative at the Council. Dr. Coleman went to Harvard College, was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford, where she did her doctoral work, and then before her career in foreign policy, spent many years as a management consultant and also as a corporate executive, but has been at the CFR for the last decade. She is the author of numerous books. The most recent one is Paradise Beneath Her Feet, which I'm holding up here. And she has her areas of expertise involve democratization, civil society, economic development, regional gender issues, educational reform, and microfinance. To my left is Professor Mohammad Fadel, who is an associate professor and Canada Research Chair at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. Professor Fadel did his law degrees and undergraduate degrees from UVA. He also has a PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Chicago. And he practiced at Sullivan and Cromwell for a number of years in New York in corporate finance, and then he began his academic career about half a dozen years ago at the University of Toronto, and he writes widely on issues ranging from medieval Islamic law to the state of Muslim minorities in the liberal West, and more recently now to political and constitutional transformation in the Middle East, and we're grateful that he came down from Toronto for this. And then to my far left is Professor Kristen Stilt, who is a professor of law and history at Northwestern University. Kristen did her undergraduate and law degrees at UT Austin and has a PhD from Harvard in history. And she is an expert on aspects of Islamic law and Islamic legal history. Her book, whose title I'm going to read out to you, is Islamic Law in Action, Authority, Discretion, and Everyday Experience in Mamluk Egypt, was published by Oxford University Press last year, and that's a big accomplishment. And all of our speakers, this year she's visiting at Harvard Law School for the entire year, and we're grateful that she came down to Boston, from Boston to New York. Everyone on the panel has been very engaged, not just through their scholarship and writing, but also as kind of a public intellectual, particularly over the last year, as the political transformations in the Middle East have unfolded. And so we're very grateful that they were all made themselves available to come and speak to us today. So the way we're going to proceed is that each of our panelists is going to make a brief set of opening remarks of between 5 and 7 minutes. And so we'll begin with Professor Fadel, then to Professor Stilt, and then finally to Dr. Coleman, and then we will open it up to questions from the floor and more panel discussion. So, Mohammad,
Okay, thank you, Sujit, for that marvelous introduction, and it's wonderful to be here. I'm going to have to try to get through my remarks very quickly so we can leave enough time for the other panelists and for you to ask your very important questions. Now, the first thing I want to say is that are we justified in thinking of this as an Arab phenomenon, as the name suggests, as the name Arab Spring suggests? And I would say yes, because we can speak meaningfully of an Arab state system that came into existence over the last 25 years, which in my opinion is characterized by the following features: non-ideological, authoritarian, oligarchical capitalism, undergirded by alliances with foreign patrons, externally, and an ever-growing and ever more repressive internal security apparatus domestically, whose function was to protect the material interests of the oligarchs themselves rather than civil society broadly. Right? And so these revolutions, wherever you see them, in Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Bahrain, right, they're essentially revolutions against this kind of political order, and it's a political order, I think, that dominates, that's characteristic of the Arab states from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf. Now, if that's true, then I think it's fair to say that neither the Tunisian nor the Egyptian revolutions are ideological revolutions, certainly not in the sense either of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, or even the Iranian Revolution. Rather, these are revolutions that I call restorative because they want to restore the state, the legal state in Tunis, Tunisia, and in Egypt, to its nationalist democratic roots from which it emerged in the first half of the 20th century. So we can contrast the goals of these revolutions, or their desire to have a rule of law, to replace what came to be a rule by law in both the Ben Ali regime and the Mubarak regime, where law was used as an instrument to further the interests of narrow oligarchies rather than the interests of the people as a whole. Right? Okay, so that's the past. What about the present? So both Tunisian and Egyptians were successful in toppling these oligarchical regimes. But now what comes next? I think both publics in Tunisia and Egypt are stuck in a very complicated transition period in which they face profound economic problems on the one hand, and they're also characterized by profound ideological divisions regarding identity of the state going forward. Now, both countries had been considered model IMF clients with respect to their implementation of the so-called Washington Consensus in the 90s, namely privatization of state-owned enterprises and reduction of social welfare subsidies. And both countries had experienced relatively high rates of growth, but that growth had not been distributed broadly across all social classes. For example, in Egypt, 40% of the population was still living on $2 a day or less at the time of the revolution, despite a decade of reasonably impressive growth, right? At the same time, while the Egyptian government under Mubarak had been cutting subsidies that supported the poor, for example, public education and public health, subsidies enjoyed by the well-off, for example, the gasoline subsidy, continued to be supported rather robustly. Both countries also faced tremendous development gaps between the cities and the countryside, in addition for the need to continue to attract substantial foreign investment to create opportunities for a burgeoning population. 50% of Egypt's population is less than 25. 54% of Tunisia's population is under 30, right? So there are huge structural unemployment problems that will require very large injections of investment to solve them, and there's not enough domestic savings to meet those needs, right? Now, Tunisia, relative to Egypt, starts at a much higher level, has a superior infrastructure, a much better educated labor force, and a much more effective governmental bureaucracy. Now, while Ben Ali, in my opinion, was much more brazen in his efforts to plunder private wealth than Mubarak's administration can best be characterized as having been a period of malign neglect, during which public institutions were left to rot, with the result that it will be very difficult to implement policy reforms in Egypt relative to Tunisia, given the demoralization and endemic corruption of public institutions in Egypt relative to Tunisia. Now, Tunisia and Egypt are both, or the publics in both of those countries, are both profoundly divided on questions of identity and the appropriate balance between a religious conception of the state and a purely secular one. Both states, however, it should be noted, explicitly adopt Islam as the state religion, and in Egypt, Islamic law is constitutionally the principal source of legislation. What these commitments entail in both countries, however, remains deeply contested. More secular elements of the public in both societies attempted to remove these references from the post-revolutionary constitutions, but the efforts were met with substantial resistance and were eventually withdrawn. So I would say that the broad middle in Tunisia and in Egypt are broadly committed to retaining some sort of formal Islamic identity to the state, albeit one that is grounded in the reformist Islamic traditions of the later half of the 19th and 20th centuries, in which Tunisian religious scholars actually played a very important role in that reform movement. It was not just Egyptians. Now, religion is more complicated in Egypt for two reasons. First, there's the existence of a sizable non-Muslim minority, namely the Egyptian Copts, who comprise about 10% of the population. And second, the existence of a sizable group of Muslims that are known as Salafis. Salafis are not part of the modernist project. The Muslim Brotherhood, for all its faults, at least pays nominal lip service to the idea of modernism and reform. And now, while Salafis exist in Tunisia, they're an insignificant political force, but recent elections in Egypt proved that they have an important social base. They got about 25% of the votes. Now, the future, despite the significance that the popular press gives to the religious-secular division in both countries, I think the real action is going to be in the economics and whether or not these transitional governments will be able to handle or solve the economic problems that both of these societies face. For that reason, I think it would be wise to defer the most divisive questions in both countries regarding the balance between individual liberties and sort of, I guess, identity, and focus instead on the structural problems to promote a more accountable system of government, to make sure that we reduce police abuse and torture, and establish a more equitable distribution of national income. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Kristen.
Okay. Thanks very much, Sujit, for organizing this. It's obviously an important and hot topic. So glad to be here. So let me say some broad comments and then narrow down to Egypt, the place I know best. So some broad comments, we might ask ourselves, what phenomenon are we looking at? What's the scope? What's the content, time and place? Where did it begin? Did it end? How will we know when it's over? So the content, we might say, is obvious, right? It's anti-authoritarian democratic movements. And these are obviously political goals. But is that all, really? I mean, didn't at least some of these movements also have economic, social, and cultural goals as well? In fact, weren't economic complaints at the heart of some of the early demonstrations? So it's far more than a political movement. And what are the beginnings? Tunisia is the obvious site to think about, but maybe we should consider a wider focus and think about maybe Afghanistan and Iraq as the beginnings of this change in the region. Of course, changes there were prompted by external forces, so maybe that makes it different from the internal movement we've seen in Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, Syria, etc. But in terms of major shifts from authoritarianism, maybe the fall of the Soviet Union and Eastern European is the beginning of what historians will look back at as this anti-authoritarian moment. So we don't really know yet. In terms of geography, we may think that it's an Arab movement, as Mohammad had said. And we see Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria on the way. What about the monarchies? Are they going to be included too? If Bahrain succeeds, what does that say about Saudi Arabia and the future of the Gulf monarchies? But if we include economic demands in our analysis, maybe then concessions are part of this movement. Maybe, in fact, Saudi's concessions to allow women to work in lingerie shops is part of the Arab Spring, if economics count as part of the movement. And what about Russia? Anyone watching Russia? Those signs against Putin look very much like the signs against Mubarak, and so do the slogans. And what about our own Occupy Wall Street movements? Can we put this under the umbrella of the same phenomenon? And then in terms of endings, how will we know when there's been success achieved? In Tunisia, my colleague Malika Zagal tells me that there are postage stamps commemorating the revolution in Tunisia. Maybe that means it's over and they've moved on. But in Egypt, at the one-year anniversary, the headlines of the non-official papers said the revolution continues. It is by no means over in Egypt. And of course, Syria and other places have yet to figure out what will happen. Libya is, of course, in a great state of flux as well, with torture allegations against the transitional government. So it's hard to say that Libya has moved from an authoritarian to a democratic political system yet. So what's the shape of the new politics in these regions and regimes? The success of the Islamist parties, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is no surprise to any of us here in Tunisia and Egypt. And in Libya, people were a little bit surprised when one of the first statements by the transitional government talked about lifting polygamy restrictions and bringing in Islamic banking. So it's very clear that Islamism as a public phenomenon will certainly play a greater role in all of these societies. But there are complexities around the Islamism and nuances, and certainly there were some surprises. The ultra-conservative Noor party in Egypt, their success was a shock to a lot of people, including, I might even say, the Muslim Brotherhood, who now has to figure out how to work with far more conservative elements in parliament. In Tunisia, there were different dynamics with agreements made up front between the Islamist party and the liberals about things like family law, not to touch it. And also in Tunisia, some of the ultra-religious parties were not even allowed to register for the election process. So just to sort of conclude with some comments about Egypt, one very interesting phenomenon is how the Muslim Brotherhood negotiated the early days of the revolution and how that was portrayed in the American media and academic circles. They did a lot of reassuring, if you recall. We will only run in 1/3 of the seats. We won't run a presidential candidate. Please don't be afraid of us. In part, they were talking to Egyptians, but they were also talking to the Americans, right? The fear is we might intervene if we see Egypt turning towards Iran, looking like Iran. And here I would say I think the American media and the popular press has grown a little bit and will have to grow further in ceasing to see two models in the region, Turkey and Iran. There's a lot in the middle, and now these countries are going to occupy the middle. And what's that going to look like? What's the Islamism of Tunisia and Egypt, and I would suspect Syria and other places, going to look like going forward? And how will the American context have to adjust to understand that? Finally, the last comment. Old tensions have come to the surface as a result of these revolutions, and that's very clear. If Iraq is part of our story, that's an early example. When the authoritarian leaves, existing tensions become very profound. In Egypt, what are those fault lines? Gender and religion are two important ones, that's for sure. The early images from Tahrir that you saw a year ago, women leaders, youth, Christians and Muslims working together, those images have changed. And the images today are very different and really reinforce the idea that the revolution is not over in Egypt, whether it's a political, economic, social, or cultural revolution. And I'll leave you with two recent images. One was the Muslim Brotherhood, a few days ago, teaming up with the military, essentially teaming up, to block protesters from getting to the parliament, to protest the ongoing military rule, right? A very big shift from the early days when the Muslim Brotherhood was out there, at least to some extent, in Tahrir Square with the revolutionaries. It suggests that maybe the structures are the same, but the players have just changed. Another image I'll leave you with is the new parliament, which was just seated, the lower house, at least in Egypt. 10 women hold out of 508 seats, right? That's a bit of a contrast to some of the images from Tahrir. So think of a room 3 times this size with 10 women, parliamentarians, sitting there amongst 400 plus men, so 10 seats out of 508. The revolution is not over in Egypt. It may be over in some other areas, but I think in a year from now, we're going to be talking about some of the same issues.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Isobel.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be on this panel with such distinguished colleagues, so thank you for including me. I think both Mohammad and Kristen have said some very interesting things, and I'd like to pick up on a couple of those. First of all, I strongly concur with Mohammad that really going forward, it's the economy, stupid. I mean, it really is going to be about the economy. These revolutions were instigated not just for economic reasons. There was a lot of social and political frustration and anger that brought people out to the streets, but they will live and die on how well these new governments can deliver economically. They're very high expectations that people have. And while I think it's great to hope that they can defer some of these very difficult questions to the future, and that may be the best path for them, these tricky questions, particularly over the relationship between religion and politics. I don't know that they'll be able to, and you already see it happening. The reality is that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Al-Nahda Party in Tunisia are both trying to hew to the center. And they have this much more conservative party on their flank, which surprised them. I agree with you. I think that they were surprised in Egypt at how well Al-Nahda did. And right now, what Ennahda is dealing with in Tunisia is trying to walk a very fine line with some of these increasingly radical groups in Tunisia that are shutting down universities over the right for women to wear the niqab in class and to take exams with their faces covered, shutting down and harassing a movie theater that showed the movie Persepolis because it was an insult to Islam. And so you have some very divisive social issues that are playing out right now in Tunisia. And in Egypt, of course, you have another image. You know, Kristen just gave some great images, recent images from Egypt. Another one is the seating of the new parliament and the Muslim Brotherhood trying to call order as the Salafis come up and don't want to say the official oath. They want to amend onto it, tack onto it a religious prayer, in effect. And it was very disruptive, and there were a lot of shouting. There was fisticuffs in the new parliament. And here is this Muslim Brotherhood trying to keep the order. And there are two issues that I think are going to be contentious, and both have been mentioned, which is religious minority rights and women's rights. And we've already seen tensions on both of these points in both countries emerging, particularly so in Egypt. Now, I think one of the good things is that in recent years, both of these political parties, Ennahda in Tunisia, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, have had time to think about the relationship between Islam and human rights, not on center stage as they are now, but they've had time to think about it in the wings. Now, Rashid Ghannouchi has been in London for years and has been exposed to modern economy, modern ways of thinking. And when he returned to Tunisia, he was very adamant in saying, look, my focus will be on practical economic issues. I don't want to, we did make deals with liberals. They're forming a coalition with the liberals in Tunisia to say we're not going to focus on personal status law and trying to redo that. And the Muslim Brotherhood, when they became the unofficial opposition party in 2005 in Egypt, they had people demanding that they put forward a party platform. What do you stand for? And there were two very controversial things in that. One is that a woman could not be president, and nor could a Copt, a non-Muslim. And it sparked a lot of debate within the party itself over why. What basis can we say that? And you've seen those debates play out on television. You've seen it play out in newspapers, and more recently, you've seen a lot of it play out in social media, on Facebook, on Twitter. A lot, the Ikhwan has its own website, and there's a lot of debate that you can see going on these topics, and they are going to be contentious. The fact is that I think in Tunisia, the personal status law, for a variety of reasons, probably won't be touched. But in Egypt, it will. And it will because you've had parties from the left and the right saying they're illegitimate, they're going against Islam, we don't like them. Al-Wafd also doesn't like them. And a lot of people, they call them Suzanne's laws after First Lady Suzanne Mubarak. And so you see people talking about these issues and wanting to engage on them. I think it will be hard to defer them to the future. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you for those opening remarks. You'll be hearing more from our panelists, but I thought we'd open it up with questions from the floor. Are there any initial rounds of questions? Yes, sir. Could you please just identify yourself for the benefit of the speakers?
an attorney in California. Hi. Joel Bainan, the professor of Egyptian studies, among other things, has emphasized that there was, or argued there's been a major role for workers' organizations and unions played a major role in Egypt leading up to and during the last year. And I'm just wondering if that, anything like that is playing a role elsewhere in the region.
Okay. Who would like to take that?
Tunisian workers have been very active in the revolution, right? So that certainly can be recognized to be true in Tunisia. They're very well organized. They were among the first to break away or attempt to break away from the Ben Ali regime. And truth be told, a lot of people attribute the Egyptian revolution to, or find its origins in labor protests and agitation that took place in the textile sector, beginning in the latter half of the previous decade.
Anyone else? No? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Have any implications
to
you for this?
Well,
does that have implications for this question about which agenda is going to be
yeah,
pursued?
I've tried to argue that if you try to look at the Egyptian revolution from a class perspective, it was workers and I guess you would say sort of the urban elites, urban educated elites, right? And for it to succeed, I think there has to be transformative economic policies that would restore Egypt to more of a social democracy. But what makes me a little disturbed so far is that I don't find enough attention being paid to the restoration of the kind of social democratic institutions that Egypt will need to be able to negotiate this transition successfully.
Can I just pick up on your comment about political economy? So I was in Egypt in November during the election campaign, and what struck me, and Egyptian colleagues concurred, is how little discussion there was of economic policy. And if there was, it was very unspecific. And so in the Delta, it'd be, we'll make your life better, right? You'll have more bread, you'll have better roads, but there wasn't a whole lot of any, even from the liberal parties, right? From the urban elite liberal parties. Was there any specificity, right, on issues of the economy? So why is that? I mean, and what does that suggest about what's going to happen over the next year or two?
Well, I think in Egypt, one of the big problems you have is that the leading economic figures and leading economic actors in Egypt, some of them are in jail, some of them are in exile, and all of them are discredited. And so this, Mohammad referred to Egypt and Tunisia following, the Washington Consensus. Well, that actually did deliver strong growth. I mean, Egypt had 7-8% growth in recent years, but it didn't deliver it in an equitable way, as you mentioned. And so now, there's I think a feeling of let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. And people are scared, I think, to talk about liberal economic policies because they realize there's a lot of anger towards it and a lot of frustration. You also have there are not that many people in the Muslim Brotherhood you can point to who are, considered to be focused on business and the economy. A lot of these people are doctors, they're engineers, but they're not necessarily business people. There are some, and some have a high profile, and I think you do hear those members of the Brotherhood talking out about economic issues, but they're not a lot. In Tunisia, you hear a lot more about it, and you do have more of a savvy, sort of business-oriented class, particularly within the Brotherhood, and they're actually, I think, pursuing some pretty solid economic policies right now.
Such as?
Well, they're very focused on attracting foreign direct investment, and they really recognize that given demographics, with this young population that they're talking about and the aging of the population rapidly in Europe, that their economic future is tied to being able to attract foreign direct investment as they have already. Tunisia has been successful relatively compared to other countries in doing that, but to do it at a much higher level and to reassure the companies that they and the states that they look to in Europe that they are open for business.
No, I'd just add that, as Mohammad pointed out, Tunisia went into this with a much stronger legal system, and the Egyptian legal system was not strong to start with. The economy is in a terrible state of affairs, and all the parties know if they can't deliver to the poorest they're not going to make it. And I think they're very nervous as to how they could possibly do that. I think they're very concerned and don't have a plan.
But I would just add quickly on the economy in Egypt. I mean, a big portion of it is tourism.
Right.
And when you've got, you've got this conservative group, NOR, talking about banning alcohol, banning bikinis on the beach, it's not really conducive to tourism.
The tourists have been gone for a year.
Right,
I mean,
but
that's
they're not
a
coming
huge,
back
and they're not
when
coming
they-
back anytime soon.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes, sir, in the back. Okay. You can just please identify yourself.
My name is Josh Drapkin. I'm a 1L here at NYU. You all have spoken a lot about redistribution of economic capital and political capital. In Egypt, isn't sort of the elephant in the room in both those situations the military? In terms of political and economic capital, I mean, Mubarak was the top of the political pyramid, and you knock him off, you still have a lot of the rest of the structure. And they hold an estimated 30% of the economy, and as you mentioned, with tourism gone, that's probably even more. So how do you confront that, and given the patronage system they built around those holdings, what can, if anything, liberal parties or even the Muslim Brotherhood do to deal with that?
Okay, well, who wants to start? I think.
I guess I'm
Yeah,
foolish
right.
enough to try to answer this
Yeah.
question. I think part of the problem, of course, is we don't really know what percentage of the economy the military controls. I guess the Egyptian GDP as of 2010 was $210 billion. On purchasing power parity, more like 550 or something. 30% would suggest that it's 60 billion. That, I don't know, that strikes me as a lot, but it could be, who knows. I think there's still a lot of things that can be done, even under the assumption that the government is not going to be able to control the military, which I take for granted, right? I don't think it's realistic to think that you're going to have 100% civilian control over the military in Egypt. Egypt has an exceptionally low level of taxation collection. I think Egypt, one of the big challenges that any new government is going to face is how to expand the tax base. Egyptians are not used to paying taxes, right? The well-off, right? There's a lot of informal economy. You have, again, as I said earlier, subsidies toward the relatively well-off, like in gasoline. There are lots of things I think that the Egyptian government can, a legitimate Egyptian government could do to address these structural inefficiencies that could give it some breathing space. And my hope is that if it does these things, it can get enough international credibility to attract enough long-term investment to address the long-term problems like underinvestment in education. You can't attract good foreign investment if you don't have an educated workforce. But it'll take a long time to get an educated workforce. So you're going to have to get some sort of external investment to be able to finance that. But you're not going to, that won't happen unless investors have confidence that you'll be able to pay back those debts through future growth, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add in that it's about economics, obviously, and it's about power, and it's about the Constitution now, right? Because in fact, the military's desire to cling to power has a couple of goals behind it: to maintain these economic privileges, to avoid immunity from prosecution, to try to keep the military budget out of parliamentary scrutiny, out of civilian hands. And these underlying goals are in large part why the military is clinging to power, and indeed creating a situation where the Constitution is supposed to be written in a rushed fashion in the coming months, and presidential elections will take place only after the Constitution is written. What's the logic behind that order? It's because they want to stay in power. In the absence of a president, they are in power. The Constitutional Declaration says that the military steps down when the parliament has been seated and a president has been elected. So the parliament is partly seated, the rest will come in the coming months. So they are in control until that president is elected. So these desires have now influenced the constitutional process, and of course the Constitution should be about a lot more than the military. It should be about these other very important matters, and rushing it through in order to achieve these ends is not ideal for the country as a whole.
Any more? Stephen Holmes.
Yeah, this is just another way to ask the same question. What's the state of negotiations between the military and the Brotherhood? Or have they reached an agreement, or are they still struggling over certain things? How do you explain what's going on between the two parties?
Well, that depends who you listen to. There's a lot of conspiracy theory on this exact point. People, saying that the Brotherhood was in cahoots with the military from the beginning. I'm not really sure of how to answer that. I read lots on that topic, and there are a lot of differing views. But Kristen, you gave an example of them, the military and the Brotherhood working closely in tandem, and we've seen that in a number of ways. And I think there will be some type of accommodation, some type of distribution of power. What form that takes is, I think, still to be determined. I don't know.
Mohammad and Kristen?
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one thing that people should be aware of is there is a very strong constituency in Egypt who believes that stability is extremely important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of people think that it is not the time to be pressing for all these goals that what we call the revolutionaries are demanding, that the situation is too fragile. The police effectively have gone on strike since the day of the revolution.
Who do they vote for, just out of interest, right? The pro-stability group of Egyptians,
I
what
think
party
that's
do they
the
support?
Muslim Brotherhood vote,
For sure.
Okay.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
I mean, and just to add to that, Egypt is not Tahrir Square. You get outside of Tahrir Square.
Right.
People say to me, I'm going to Egypt next month. Is it safe? Well, all they see is Tahrir Square. Get outside of it, and life carries on.
I think we can answer your question in two ways. One is to look at visible manifestations of overlapping goals, and then actual evidence of agreement. The latter is hard, and there are probably layers of that as well. It's probably the case that there have been agreements on some big issues, and probably some details are being worked out. Things like how much immunity will the Muslim Brotherhood try to get for the military in the Constitution. But we can look at evidence where their interests just beautifully align. The constitutional referendum, the military wanted to go through, the Muslim Brotherhood wanted to go through. So it's hard to know were those tacit agreements or just really good times when they overlap.
So let me just pick up on this point, right? So on November 18th, the protests in Tahrir, right, was led by the Islamist parties, right, on the transition timetable, right, because they wanted civilian rule today, right, after the election. So, and it was the liberals, right, and so I mean, in the fall, in terms of the liberals, the Islamists, the Brotherhood in particular, in the military. The debate about the constitutional principles, right, put liberals in the military in one camp against Islamists in the other. So, how the alliances are working out seems to be, shifting with each particular issue.
Mm-hmm. And I would say at the beginning there might have been a good alignment, especially in the early days of the constitutional referendum. Then there was a middle period of a lot of flux. I think we're at the end now where we see more alignment and more agreements.
But I just want to pick up on, I think that there are going to be a couple of areas that are key, and one is transitional justice, this whole immunity question, and the other is the economy. We don't know what percent, but we know it's a big percent of the economy, and they want to protect their privileged economic position. And if you look at other transitions, look at in Chile, for example, through that transition there, the military was able to maintain constitutionally a preferred agreement where they got 10% of the revenue from the copper mines. And in perpetuity, that was only changed last year. And so, last year, maybe it was 2010 now, but recently, I forget what year we're in. But my only point is you can imagine that there would be something around how they get to maintain their economic privilege.
Can I make a follow-up on
of
it?
course, yeah.
I think it would be, at this point, sort of fair to make just the following observation, that the military extracts lots of its resources in kind from the Egyptian economy. But we shouldn't think that this is an exclusive attribute of the Egyptian military. Lots of civilian bureaucracies, too, were bought off by in-kind contributions from the state. And this is, a point that I wanted to make in my presentation, but I couldn't, is that the relative top quarter of Egyptian society is going to be called on to make dramatic sacrifices if they want Egypt to go forward. And I don't think there's much consciousness of that. I mean, there's consciousness that, well, we want to get the military under control, but it's not quite clear that they're ready to give up their own perks that they enjoyed under the ancient regime. And I think that's part of the problem. I think if it was made more explicit that everybody is going to be giving up these in-kind perks, then it might be easier to get the military to play ball.
There was a hand back there a while ago. Yes, we'll just get the microphone to you. So you could just state your name again. And yep.
Hi,
Can you
I'm
stand up, please?
Steve Zayden. I'm an LM here at NYU.
Yeah.
And I have a more sort of political question. You've talked about the Islamic movement that is especially happening in Tunisia, for example, and also Egypt. We don't know where it leads. So my question is, what kind of impact will this have towards like the Western countries, the US, and also the relationship between them, and also in particular Israel as the democratic and neighbor in the area? So that's my question in the next years.
I think everyone wants to
Anyone?
Okay. Anyone? Well, let's start here.
well,
Yeah.
one thing I would say, and this point was made earlier, is that I think you've seen the American public anyway, and certainly among policymakers, develop over the past year a more nuanced understanding of political Islam.
Yeah.
And it used to be, a career-limiting move to say, I'm going to Egypt and I'm going to meet with the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, there were congressmen who did it, but they were deeply criticized at home for cavorting with terrorists. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood after 2005 was the kind of leading, not an official party, but unofficially the leading opposition group in parliament. So, but if they dared to try to meet with Muslim Brotherhood members, they got it both from Mubarak and they got it at home from constituents. And so it was a very tricky situation. American politicians have had almost no contact with Muslim Brotherhood leaders in Egypt, for example, and really don't understand, what they stand for, what they mean. And now you're beginning to see people develop a more nuanced understanding, particularly because, now the Muslim Brotherhood actually seems to be the moderate party. Now you've got something more frightening than the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafis. Who are these Salafis? What are they? And that is forcing a greater awareness that, you can't just paint Islamists with one single brush, and that there are some very distinct differences. And I think what you see now among policymakers and among the public is an attempt to say, okay, look, we have lots of shared interests that we can work with Islamists, and there are probably some red lines that, are no-go that we cannot work with. And figuring that out is, I think, a very healthy development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I said in my opening remarks, if you look back at the press in the first weeks a year ago, the questions were to the experts, to us, is this going to be like Iran? Right? Is Egypt going to become Iran? That was the model. There weren't nuanced models of different varieties, right? And those are the kind of questions we got all the time. And then, of course, the other question is, what do they stand for? They don't know what they stand for necessarily, because they didn't have to be in power. And so
Right.
we can look at the Muslim Brotherhood in 2007. They issued this fascinating document when they thought they were going to be a political party. And I've studied that in great depth. They didn't even know then, and that's when they were far more unified than they are now. So they don't really know, and we won't know. It's going to be an empirical question to see what do they do, and that's how we'll know what they believe.
I think there are a couple of things that can be, I think, said broadly, regardless of who ends up sort of controlling the governments in Tunisia or in Egypt. One is that the United States, unfortunately, does not have a large store of good credit in civil societies in either country or in the region generally. And so interestingly enough, at least in Tunisia, I think this is probably true in Egypt as well, the liberal or secular left has criticized Ennahda as being the pro-American party. And so there's this, the reality is that being associated with the United States is not considered a politically popular move domestically. And part of that reason is, as I said in my opening remarks, the Arab state system was characterized by external dependence on foreign patrons and domestic reliance on a security apparatus. One of the purposes of these revolutions was to get rid of that. I mean, that was downplayed in the press here, but when you talk to people there, there was a nationalist element in the sense that we want to reclaim our own independence. That does not mean hostility, right? But it does mean a sort of a healthy self-regard for one's own self-interest.
Can I just pick up on that to pose a question to the panel, which is, Mohammed, you drew this distinction between the resource-rich Arab states and those that aren't, and so that would be Tunisia and Egypt. And so Egypt's almost out of foreign currency reserves, right? And so they've gone back to the IMF after having rejected a deal in July. And so, is there not, so to that discussion will lead to not less foreign involvement in the Egyptian economy, but more, right? Potentially significantly more. So I'm just wondering how these agendas are going to mesh.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a huge tension here, as you've pointed out. And I think, Mohammed, you're absolutely right. Part of it is sort of regaining our sovereignty, right? And that was behind rejecting the IMF deal last summer. But now, they've kind of hit a wall and they don't have too many other places to turn. By the way, these rich Gulf countries who promised a lot of money haven't delivered. That's interesting. It's part of their balance of payments problem. But I think that, what you're seeing is that play out in some populist policies. I mean, right now, this detention of these Americans in Egypt, and they're
Prevented from
preventing
leaving,
from
yeah,
leaving.
the
Thank you.
country.
That doesn't sit well with Congress, which is about to, say, okay, we're going to cut all of the aid to Egypt. Now, that would be popular on the street in Egypt to say, yeah, let's do it. But on the other hand, it's economically not insignificant for the country. Most of it is military aid. A part of it is direct assistance. But more broadly, it just sort of creates this tension when Egypt, what it really needs to be doing is thinking about restarting a free trade agreement with the United States. I mean, that would be a much more healthy thing to do, which Congress is not predisposed to free trade agreements anyway, but certainly not when our citizens are being detained. So, this is a tension that's gonna play out, and I think it'll be a real challenge for the Muslim Brotherhood to manage.
The last questioner asked about Israel, and I don't want to avoid that. And
yeah.
it ties into our conversation now, right? Because why did Egypt receive so much American money?
Absolutely.
And what were the conditions on that? And will those conditions be renegotiated at Egypt's assistance? Will they have the ability to? And how will all of this affect Israel? And those are, I think, big questions. I don't think Egypt is interested now in shaking any of those issues, especially not the Camp David Accord.
Well,
but in the future,
why are they not interested? I mean, it would be very popular politically, but economically, it could be devastating. I mean, it would be devastating not only because of it would isolate them versus Europe and America, but also, Israel is the most dynamic, largest non-oil economy in the region, and Egypt looks to Israel as a potential economic partner. It already is an economic partner, and one of the friction points are over these gas deals that have been signed, and what role and what sweetheart deals did Mubarak and some of his cronies get. But the fact is that Egypt's an important and could be a much more important trading partner. And one of the ways to stimulate economic growth in the Middle East is more intra-regional trade. This is a region that has very, very low intra-regional trade. I mean, look at Morocco and its neighbors. I mean, it's pathetic, so.
With respect to external financing of Egypt's current account deficit, I tend to think of Egypt's present problems as liquidity, not insolvency. Important distinction. Egypt's foreign debt represents only 30% of its GDP. So it has a relatively low external debt ratio to GDP. Right now, it's facing a potential liquidity crisis because there's no tourism and there's been no FDI, foreign direct investment, for the last year. But if there's a successful transition, I suspect that they will return, tourists and FDI. And I think if there are bold structural economic reforms, I think Egypt is very capable of absorbing $15 to $20 billion of FDI annually. It had been getting almost 10 under Mubarak, and so if reforms are made, I think that could double. So Yes, there's a serious impending foreign exchange problem, but it's liquidity. It's not solvency.
Yeah, what I meant is it's a liquidity problem that its rich Gulf neighbors could actually help with very quickly and enormously, and they have promised but not actually come
Well,
through.
I think part of that is that they are also trying to exercise power over how the transition goes.
Yeah.
Sir, over there. Just wait till the microphone gets to you. Could you stand, please, and just let us know who you are?
Michael Sochinsky, I'm a 1L. And my question is just to sort of broaden the discussion back to the beginning. You know, it's called the Arab Spring, but we're really only talking about Egypt and Tunisia. We mentioned some of the other countries at the very beginning, but I'm wondering if it's sort of a too optimistic characterization to apply it to the whole region. And if you guys see what happened in Libya and Yemen and Bahrain and now in Syria as part of the same movement or totally distinct. Like pessimistically, it might be totally unrelated and driven by different things.
Okay. So we'll start on the left here.
Well, that was, I guess, in my opening comments, exactly the kind of question I was trying to provoke. So thank you for coming back to it. What are we looking at? And how do we know that the moment has been concluded? We might say Tunisia is down the path a little bit to concluding this moment, but they've only started. So really, I would say we have to wait. I think the trajectory is clear. I think Syria and the Gulf states eventually will come to this, but whether it's a year or 2 or 5, it's hard to say. So will we look back at this and call it the anti-authoritarian decade? It's sort of hard to know. But I would put them all under the same heading with the question of we're going to have to wait. Maybe we have to wait a while.
I think for the reasons that I stated in my presentation, it is justifiable to call this an Arab moment because there are certain shared characteristics, political economic characteristics among all the Arab states, and they are being challenged throughout the Arab world. You might not see it in Saudi Arabia, but it's there. Right, but I would say it's more like termites burrowing in the walls, but they're burrowing, and the Saudi government, I think, is quite unstable. Look at who are their rulers. You got to, I jokingly said one time that they probably have their national council meetings in the geriatric ward of some hospital, right? I don't think it's a very viable regime in the long term. I think the most decisive moment of this year was not Mubarak resigning. It was when the Saudi Arabians sent in their army into Bahrain and the United States said absolutely nothing, right? And so I do think that this is a region-wide movement. And although I was born in Egypt, I try hard to resist Egyptian sort of centricism or any kind of Egyptian pride. But for good or for ill, Egypt often serves as the model for the rest of the Arab world. So the administrative and legal models for the Gulf states and the eastern part of the Arab world come from Egypt. If there's a successful transition in Egypt, it's going to have a dramatic impact on the rest of the region. And that's why I think that, in fact, when we look back on this 20 years from now, we will discover that Saudi Arabia played a very strong role in financing what in Egypt is popularly known as the counter-revolution.
I think that I don't like the term Arab Spring because it sounds so optimistic and short. It's a short, defined period of time. I think we're going through a very long period of unrest, and that in places it will play out in Tunisia, I think more optimistically, more quickly, and in others it will be prolonged, and there could be some very negative consequences. Libya is interesting. We haven't really talked about Libya. But it's a small country, a small population of 5 million people with enormous wealth. Much of it, Gaddafi, for all his craziness, had these huge sovereign wealth funds that are sitting in London and New York and Switzerland and other places, and there's enormous wealth there. I think these tensions over, secularism versus Islamism and some of these things are going to play out, but ultimately they have the economic resources to transform the country in positive ways if they can get their act together, in ways that Egypt, couldn't even imagine. But in other places, Yemen's a very, very poor country. It has the worst human statistics of any country in the region. It has, 60% illiteracy. It's running out of water. People are addicted to growing cot, which uses up the water, and chewing cot, which reduces productivity. You've got armed insurgencies going on. It's got a whole bunch of problems beyond its political situation. Saudi, it's interesting. People have been counting out the Saudi regime for decades, and they continue on. I wouldn't bet against the Saudi regime. Just as a lot of Egyptians want stability, Saudis want stability too. There are Saudis who want change, of course, but I think they want incremental change. And there will be a transition in Saudi, just by physics. There's biology. There is an aging gerontocracy there that will pass power to the next generation at some point in the coming decade. And when that happens, people will have high expectations, and they'll want to see probably more change, faster change, and we'll see if the Saudi regime can deliver it. They have a lot of resources. Part of what they did is hand out $136 billion to their people in the spring when they were nervous about the unrest. That's a whole lot of dough, right? But they have one of the fastest growing populations in the world, 25 million people, set to double in the next 20 years. Their resources will go less far, and they will be able to do that less effectively going forward, and they know that.
And note the concessions, right? Now women can participate in municipal elections in 2014, and the retail is big. This is the first time women have been able to take retail jobs. I was not joking, it's a big step. We have to watch Libya, it's very fragile, right? You've seen over the weekend, Doctors Without Borders says, oh, we've been brought torture victims to resuscitate them so they can go back to being tortured because they were seen as Gaddafi supporters. A very fragile situation there.
Can I ask you a follow-up question about the regional dimensions of this conflict? So one way to look at this is through regional actors. And so the Gulf Cooperation Council has kind of sprung into action, and Qatar, right, has sort of taken the lead role. So it was the Qatari foreign minister who was there with Nabil El-Arabi at the Security Council yesterday, speaking to the Syria resolution. So what kind of a game is Qatar playing? Okay, so on the one hand, Qatar and the GCC, they supported the Saudi intervention in Bahrain. On the other hand, they are the major promoters of the roadmap in Syria towards democratic transition, and they were the driving force behind this in the Arab League, right? So what's the agenda here of the GCC and the Qataris in particular?
Well, it is interesting. I was in Egypt when the revolution happened last January, and the meeting with some of the Egyptian leaders at the time. I mean, they were so angry towards the Qataris and blaming all the unrest on Al Jazeera, really trying to block Al Jazeera. And in many ways, you can credit Al Jazeera. They were the only really major media outlet covering what happened in Tunisia, and really broadcasting that and keeping that alive, all in December and January, when no one else was really covering those street protests before Ben Ali departed. Qatar is playing an interesting game, but I also think, from the GCC perspective, look at the Saudi role too, and I think you do see a counter-revolutionary role in terms of inviting the other monarchies. What's the deal with inviting Morocco to join the GCC? I mean, where are we with that? Well, I think it's okay. Let's circle the wagons. Let's get the kings together and say, we're here, we're going to stay, and this sort of bolster our credibility and legitimacy. What's the role of the Arab League? It's sort of hard to say. It's sort of remarkable in some respects, and both in good and bad ways, so.
And why would Saudi be a refuge for ousted dictators?
Oh, they've played that role quite admirably.
Well, guess
But
what?
it's an interesting role. It's an interesting role.
So are we. Where is Saleh? He's here in New York.
Yeah.
So,
Who's who? Where?
Ali Abdullah Saleh.
For
he's-
medical treatment, though.
Yeah, he left.
Oh, right. So,
Short-term visa.
Yeah, well, we'll see. So,
there are
and-
a lot of bizarre anti-Qatari conspiracies, not only among the former leaders, so to speak, but also, again, I saw in Tunisia a lot of the I guess more secular intellectuals in Tunisia seem to think of a Nahda as a Qatari invention and Qatari a tool of Qatari foreign policy. Same thing in Egypt. There's these charges that the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhoods are getting huge amounts of money from Qatar in particular.
And from Saudi.
Which is I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's a huge amount of foreign investments coming to Egypt that would back that up, but.
Any other questions? Jose Alvarez in the back.
So this has been a fascinating analysis, but I haven't heard much prescriptions for the IMF, what they ought to be doing, or the U.S. government, or for that matter, U.S. law students who will be engaged in these rule of law projects that our moderator is contemplating. What I've heard is we got to do a lot of wait and see, and I'm curious whether and to what extent foreigners can be involved, especially when it creates such resentments if they're perceived as being from the U.S., especially with respect to the issues like reform on foreign investment. Egypt has the most strongly pro-investment treaty between the United States and Egypt dating from 1987 or so, very much the Washington Consensus. I would think that that's ripe for changing, and perhaps the Obama administration should be thinking about that, but I'm curious what really ought to be the takeaway point by way of what should our current policy be, both the US government, the IMF, and NYU.
Well,
Isobel, why don't you start?
I guess I would take the medical oath here and say, first do no harm. Yeah. And, I think there is the potential, given the very sensitive circumstances of U.S.-Egyptian relations right now, for example. I think it's, in some of these other countries, it's probably less so. I think in Libya, you see a lot of trade missions already on the ground there. You see a lot of people, Libyans saying, we're open for business. We want to rebuild our country. The Economist just said that Libya will be the fastest growing economy in the world in 2012, albeit from a low base, of course, but it has the capacity to absorb a lot of investment right now. And in some areas, I think that this is a remarkable opportunity to actually engage in some very constructive ways. I think we have to be very careful about political meddling. Yeah. We could really do a lot of harm. But when you look at a country like Egypt, where this has already been touched upon before, there are very high levels of unemployment, particularly among college graduates. Levels of unemployment among your illiterates in Egypt is like 5%. It's the exact opposite here in the United States. The Egyptian country Egypt as a country sends about 1/3 of its youth to college. That's about the same percentage that we in the United States send. Is that the right balance? And I think there's an opportunity at the level of higher education to really engage with Egypt, because there is an element of transformation that's going on. Yeah. This, university presidents were all appointed by Mubarak. It was all based on cronyism. How well you managed up, no accountability, no transparency. And if that in fact is going to change, then you actually have an opportunity to really have an impact and change outcomes. Egypt is not a country that has dramatically underinvested in education, but I would argue that it has misspent a lot in education. There's an opportunity to spend what it spends in much better ways.
Maybe I could jump in there, because Jose posed a question to me as well. I think there's two, when you talk about what NYU's role is, I think that there's two ways to think about that. The first is, what's NYU Central University's role as part of the broader higher education sector? And the second is what NYU Law's role is. So on the first point, which is actually vitally important, I think the Arab Development Report has kind of sparked a region-wide discussion about the need for institutions of higher education of some substance and quality and independence in the Middle East. And so I think there's a lot of interest at AUB, at AUC, at NYU Abu Dhabi, of creating kind of a network of institutions of higher education with kind of a serious intellectual and research capacity, not necessarily having, not dismissing the over-enrollment kind of problems of the over-educated but yet underemployed youth, but the idea of kind of having a sophisticated higher education system as kind of a laboratory and the generator of critical and important thought and ideas, right, that is truly independent of the state, is, that's an area where I think the higher education sector in the United States could be a useful partner.
And I would just like to interject, it's easy to interact with AUC. Yeah. It's got a nice international board, and we all get it. AUC is 4,000 students. Yeah. Al-Azhar is 410,000 students. University of Cairo is 200,000 students. Yeah. That's what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In terms of the law school, I guess one of the things that struck me when I was in the Middle East, and particularly in Egypt, is, of course, there's always a deep suspicion of American involvement in any type of kind of political or constitutional transformation. That's just a baseline. I think the Iraq experience has had a catastrophic impact on American political capital in the region, and I think it's hard to appreciate until you go and talk to people. I think it has been a disaster. Particularly on legal and constitutional issues. It is the idea of asserting sovereign authority through the CPA and then bringing in American law professors and other experts to help draft an interim constitution, rightly or wrongly, whether you think it was sound policy or not, as a political matter, it has had such a negative impact, I can't even tell you. I can't even tell you how many people talk to me about this, unsolicited or unprompted. And they went out of their way to say that if they were to work with an American university in the future, it would have to be under some very circumscribed arrangement that is not that. And so I think the way that, and that is just the reality that we live in. And so on the other hand, when I flipped it around and said, okay, well, how can we help, right? What areas would you like some input on? There's no shortage of issues in which kind of civil society groups, sophisticated human rights NGOs, think tanks would love to kind of engage comparatively in a non-top-down fashion, but kind of through a network, kind of horizontal method of interaction where we're kind of bringing the best advice and resources, not just from North America, but for example, there's a lot of interest in Latin America, right? Someone said to me from EIPR, which is Hossam Bagat's NGO. She said to me, I'm tired of hearing from Germans talking about their post-authoritarian experience. I'd love to have a Chilean come to speak to me in Cairo about their more recent post-military experience. And there's lots of that, right, on a whole range of issues. Security sector oversight, a lot of interest in actually hearing how states in Eastern and Central Europe and in Latin America manage oversight of the security sector. And there's a range of anti-corruption, a lot of interest. On the other hand, issues that are obviously important, for example, the relationship between Islam and democracy, I don't think exactly people know what's at stake. There's a lot of sophisticated legal commentary. I don't think any outside help's going to make a difference. I think they just need to decide what they want to do, right? So I think outside analysis is not going to add a whole lot to what is a very rich debate that's happening already in the region. So I think kind of letting your agenda as a foreign source of advice or support be set by your regional partner and coming in to offer information, advice, and support and letting them set the pace in the agenda is actually the most important way, I think, in which a lot of, let's say, knowledge-based organizations in the United States and elsewhere, be they think tanks or universities, can help to support this process.
I echo everything that Sujit said 100%. I think what he said is absolutely perfect. I hope that the IMF has learned from this experience. The year before the Egyptian revolution, they issued this unbelievably glowing report on the state of the Egyptian economy. I think it's one of those sort of famous last words moments that maybe has caused the IMF to realize that it really needs to take into account distributive issues as well as balance of payments problems. Like I said earlier, Egypt's long-term problem is not balance of payments. It's its internal structural inefficiencies. And I think Egyptians would be perfectly willing to hear good advice from the IMF about how to overcome those structural problems. But what they don't want to hear is that you need to spend less money on poor people.
Can I just sort of pick up on that? So I had a senior Egyptian official at the UN in my office this week who said, listen, the problem in Egypt is that people hate the fact that getting credit is politicized. People want to be able to borrow money, right? They want a working banking system where access to credit does not depend on political party affiliation or clientelism or patronage, right? That is a very practical way in which foreign technical expertise can be brought to support and present options and information to Egyptians for them to decide what they do. And it's not in the constitutional space, right? It's kind of in the regulation of the economy. Mm-hmm. Where there can be a lot of help there. Yeah, sorry, Kristen.
No, just to say that the discourse, the foreign hand controlling events is such a pervasive symbol and discourse in the Egyptian press, it's almost hard to understate it, right? From the first day, it was Israelis in Tahrir, if you recall that one, right? And now it's Americans. That is such a powerful discourse, it can only get worse. And so I think to the extent foreign players can be involved.
And it will. It
Yeah.
will get worse.
Oh, that rhetoric will get worse, regardless of what actually happens. The actual events can only add to the scale. So I think going in on the constitutional side, anonymously, extremely delicately, through a organization that you build trust with, who never repeats that an American has provided the information. Yeah. Because I was going to say Iraq, and you said it as well. Egyptians have been talking about Iraq since the first day, right? And it still sits there as a powerful force. The technical side, I think, is really good. On legal education, that is a huge gap to be filled. The state of legal education and of the legal profession in Egypt, and sorry that I'm talking about Egypt again to the person who asked that question, is horrific. Being a lawyer is so far down the scale on the professional level, right? You get into law school by basically not getting into any other college on your entrance exam. It has been debased, and that goes back to Nasser's days. Cairo University Law School, and I mean, Isobel, you hinted at this as well, they were desperate for an English language LLM a few years ago, and they approached the institution I was at, and we went and looked, and there's no way we could have done it because the level of education isn't there, there's no English language skills, there's a French LLM.
And there's no real commitment to changing it.
No, that's the thing.
But now there could be.
The older faculty were hostile to the idea. Why? Because then that meant if you could speak English, you could teach in that program and you'd make more money and they'd be marginalized. But the legal institutions and the law profession, there might be technical areas there where there can be assistance.
Well, again, that's the thing. There's broad-scale institutional reform has got to be number one, right? And I think the good thing is one of the things that's made me very optimistic, and it's true that Egypt is not Tahrir, as you said, but what you have is you have many Tahrirs being replicated all across Egyptian civil society, in banks, in universities, in hospitals, etc., where, as Isobel had said, a pervasive culture of cronyism had dominated administration, especially senior management, and everybody was literally striking to throw the bums out, right? Yeah. And so there are demands now in universities to have universities elected by the faculty, right? Because they realize that the universities have been totally subverted in their mission because they were so dominated by the Egyptian executive.
But that is why I have some hope right now that these are areas where actually you can engage and very constructively. I mean, the U.S., we've said it a number of times, we don't have a good rap right now. However, U.S. higher education still is thought of as being world-class.
Absolutely.
And so that is an area where you can engage. The other thing I would say is, again, we're conflating the whole region with Egypt. Libya's, I think, quite different. You have this huge expat community that left because it was such a crazy place, and so a lot of your talent left. I mean, that's true in Egypt too, but now, as a percentage of the population, it's very big in Libya, and a lot of them are eager to head back, and they bring with them a love of Europe and the United States, and you're seeing tensions already in Libya between those who stayed and those who are coming back. There was one of the big friction points in the draft election law over whether those with dual citizenship would be allowed to vote and run. But those will kind of work their ways out, work itself out, and they have been allowed now to keep their dual citizenship. But there's a talent pool there that could play out in quite a different way.
So we have time for one last question. We're over here in the back, and then I'll give it a chance to my panelists to each offer a final word. So if you could identify yourself.
Sure, thank you. My name is Camilo Romero. It's my last semester here in law school. I was curious, particularly mentioning the very strong anti-U.S. sentiment that's been pervasive and mentioned by the panel, and perhaps in responding to Professor Alvarez's question about a prescriptive approach on this issue. I was struck by the fact that in 1919, a lot of these similar issues of uprisings took place, particularly within Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia. And I'm wondering what lessons can we learn, particularly now with the invocation of Tahrir Square here in our own Zuccotti Park, and the rhetoric, polarizing the rhetoric within Republican primaries. What lessons can we gain from past uprisings, perhaps for good or for ill?
Historians? I think it's an excellent question. Yeah. And I think, in my opinion, the reason why 2011 will end more positively for Egypt than 1919 is because the international system has changed dramatically. Egypt gained nominal independence but was still under the tutelage of Britain. Its entire foreign policy was controlled by the UK, and that eventually sort of led to a backlash against parliamentary democracy because you had formal democracy that couldn't really exercise national sovereignty. Today, I think it's possible, it's conceivable for Egypt to go on a path where the goals of independence, democracy, and development can be met simultaneously without being captured by a greater power. Because there are alternate sources of financing, right? There's China, there's Brazil. Of course, Egypt would love to have great relations with the United States, but will not have to be as dependent on one country as it did following 1919. And so I think that affords a greater margin of movement so that these different goals, namely development, democracy, and independence, aren't necessarily seen as at loggerheads. I hope.
I mean, what I would say is we have lots of examples from history of revolutions and weak, follow-on democracies being hijacked by illiberal elements, and with a period of illiberal democracy then giving way to just a new form of authoritarianism, and there's the potential for that. I don't think in Tunisia, but in Egypt there's a possibility. In Libya there's certainly a possibility. There's a potential for that. So how the choices that are made, the protection of rights, of human rights, of minority rights, rule of law, all of these things will be very important. And I remain optimistic. I'm an optimist, so I think that they will come out in a better place. But I think what history tells us is that there is the potential for illiberal democracy and a new form of authoritarianism.
And for some of the elements who were at the forefront of the revolutions becoming marginalized afterwards, which is just to say what you said in a different way. And of course, the role of women in particular, I think is a really key issue. Hopefully in Egypt and these other places as well, the women will be able to retain some of that power. It's not looking that great right now, but that's certainly a lesson we can learn from 1921 Egypt or other ones as well.
Any last words from our panel? Well, on that note, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.